The battlefield was burning. The sky was filled with smoke and fire, and the ground shook with every explosion. Broken walls, twisted metal, and the smell of blood covered everything. The alien girl Lyra crouched low behind a shattered stone barrier. Her chest rose and fell with heavy breaths. Her arms were trembling, and her weapon was almost slipping from her hands. She was alone. Her squad had been strong once, trained for war, but now they were gone. One by one they had fallen, their cries still echoing in her ears. Her heart pounded as enemy footsteps grew louder. She pressed her back to the wall and tried to steady her hands, but her body was close to collapse. Energy reserves in her armor were almost empty. Her vision blurred. She whispered to herself that this was the end. The enemies came closer. Their voices carried across the ruined street. She knew they would find her hiding place soon. Her alien instincts told her to fight to the last breath, but her tired body begged her to give up. She raised her weapon anyway, though she knew she couldn't last more than a few seconds. Then something unexpected happened. A shadow moved across the smoke. Not the enemy, but another figure. A man. His steps were steady, though his body was covered in dirt and blood. He carried no shining armor like hers, no advanced alien rifle. In his hands was a strange weapon, a mix of metal pipes and sharp edges. His eyes glowed with something fierce, something alive. Lyra froze. She had never seen him before. A human. What was a human doing here, in the middle of a battlefield that belonged to her people and their enemies? She thought for a moment that she was imagining him, a trick of her failing mind. But when the first enemy soldier appeared through the smoke, the human moved. With a roar, he swung his weapon and struck with surprising strength. The enemy dropped instantly. Another raised a blaster, but the human rolled across the ground and tackled him, ripping the weapon free. Blaster fire lit the street, but somehow the man dodged between shots, using the rubble for cover. His movements were reckless, but full of determination. Lyra's mouth opened slightly, disbelief washing over her. She almost forgot to aim her own weapon. For a heartbeat, she just watched. This fragile creature, without alien strength, without technology, fought like a storm. A blast hit near her, shaking her back to reality. She fired again, her weapon humming with energy, cutting down another enemy soldier. Dust and sparks flew around her as she realized she was no longer alone. The human ducked beside her wall, breathing hard, his face streaked with sweat and soot. "You fought well," he said, his voice rough but steady, "but you're not alone." The words struck her harder than the blast had. Her throat tightened. She wanted to ask him why he was here, why he risked his life for someone not of his kind. But there was no time. The enemies regrouped. Shouts rang out, and more shadows emerged through the smoke. Lyra and the human shared a quick look. No words were needed. She lifted her weapon again, and he tightened his grip on his broken blade. Together they leapt from cover. Energy bolts screamed past them, fire roared, and rubble fell, but their movements matched as if they had trained side by side. Lyra shot with what little power she had left, and each time her strength failed, the human was there, striking, pushing forward, shielding her. She felt her fear change into something else. Hope. For the first time since the battle began, she wasn't fighting only for herself. The human's presence gave her energy she didn't know she still had. Her arms steadied, her eyes cleared, and her heart beat with new fire. An enemy soldier raised a heavy cannon, aiming straight at them. Lyra stumbled, her weapon overheating, powerless. She thought it was the end again. But the human moved first. With a shout, he hurled a stolen blaster at the cannon, knocking it aside just before it fired. The shot exploded against the ground, shaking everything. The human was thrown back, coughing, but alive. Lyra reached out, pulling him up with trembling hands. Their eyes met for a moment. She saw pain and exhaustion in him, but also the fire that refused to die. The enemy line faltered. They had expected an easy kill, one broken alien soldier. They had not expected this. A human and an alien girl standing together, refusing to fall. Lyra raised her weapon again, her voice raw as she shouted a battle cry. The human gave a short nod and charged beside her. The ruined street lit up with fire and fury, but the broken line had been reforged. They fought on, side by side, two strangers bound by survival, by courage, by something unspoken yet powerful. And as the battle raged, Lyra felt it deep inside. She was no longer alone. Smoke drifted across the ruined street as silence fell for only a heartbeat. Lyra leaned against the broken wall, her chest burning, her weapon heavy in her arms. The human crouched beside her, catching his breath, his rough hands gripping the strange weapon made from scraps. He looked nothing like a soldier. His clothes were torn, his face scarred, but his eyes carried a fire she could not ignore. She studied him quickly, half afraid he might vanish like a ghost. Humans were said to be weak, fragile compared to her kind, yet this one fought like he had nothing left to lose. He had no shield, no advanced rifle, and still he stood against enemies that had slaughtered her entire squad. It made no sense. The human glanced at her, sweat running down his forehead. "Can you stand?" he asked simply. His words were not a question of weakness, but of readiness, as if he expected her to rise, no matter what. She forced herself upright, pain flaring in her legs. She gave a sharp nod, and for the first time since her squad died, she felt the weight in her chest lift slightly. The enemies regrouped down the road, forming a jagged line of glowing rifles. Their voices barked orders in a language Lyra understood too well. "Kill the survivors, leave no one breathing." Her heart sank, but the human tapped her arm once, a strange gesture of assurance. Then he leaned forward, eyes locked on the advancing line. When the shooting began again, they moved together. Lyra fired bursts from her failing rifle, each shot dropping an enemy soldier. But when her aim wavered, the human charged, closing the distance with reckless speed. He swung his weapon with brutal force, cutting down enemies who expected her to be alone. Something inside her shifted. She realized his presence was changing the rhythm of the fight. He didn't fight like her kind, with precision and calculation. He fought like chaos itself, forcing the enemy to stumble. She followed his lead, adjusting her own strikes, covering him when he overextended, taking shots when he distracted them. The line of enemies began to falter, confusion spreading as they tried to face two fighters who refused to break. One enemy lunged toward the human, blade raised high. Lyra didn't think. Her hand shot out, pulling him back as she fired point blank, dropping the attacker before it could strike. The human gave her a quick glance, a flash of gratitude in his eyes, before throwing himself into the next wave. For a moment, she almost smiled. The fight grew desperate. The enemy pushed harder, more arriving through the smoke. The human bled from a cut across his arm, yet he moved as if pain meant nothing. Lyra's weapon hissed, its core warning her of overheating, but she clung to it. Together, they pressed forward step by step, rubble crunching under their boots. Through the chaos, Lyra's thoughts burned with questions. Why was he here? Why did he fight for her when her own people had left her to die? She wanted to ask, to demand an answer, but every time her mouth opened, another blast or strike forced her back into the rhythm of survival. At last, the enemies pulled back, dragging their wounded, unsure how to handle the strange pair that refused to fall. The human stood tall, shoulders heaving, his weapon dripping with blood and ash. Lyra leaned heavily against the wall, exhaustion pressing down, but she kept her eyes on him. He looked over at her, his face dark with soot and pain, and gave the faintest grin. "You're still standing," he said. For the first time in what felt like forever, Lyra's lips moved into a small, tired smile. She didn't understand this man, but she knew one thing. The battle wasn't just hers anymore. The lull in the fight lasted only minutes before the sound of heavy boots returned. The enemy had not given up. They were bringing heavier weapons now. The air trembled with the charge of plasma cannons, and the glow of their armor lit up through the smoke. Lyra's knees threatened to buckle. Her rifle sputtered and hissed, its energy pack nearly dead. She knew she had nothing left to give. The human noticed her shaking arms. Without hesitation, he pulled her back behind a chunk of collapsed wall as the first cannon blast tore into the ground where she had been standing. Dust and fire sprayed across them. He covered her with his own body, shielding her from falling debris. The heat burned his skin, but he didn't flinch. Lyra looked up at him, stunned. Her people valued survival above all. No soldier would have thrown themselves in harm's way to save another when the odds were already lost. Yet this man, this fragile human, did it without a thought. His chest heaved, his clothes scorched, but his eyes still carried the same fire. "Stay low," he said firmly, then rose before she could stop him. He grabbed the blaster he had stolen earlier and fired into the advancing enemy line. The shots weren't perfect, but each one forced their foes to scatter for cover. When the weapon clicked empty, he didn't retreat. He charged forward, swinging the broken blade like it was part of his own arm. Lyra pushed herself up, ignoring the pain in her body. She couldn't let him fight alone. Her weapon flickered with weak light, but it was enough for short bursts. She covered his reckless rush, her blasts knocking down the soldiers who tried to flank him. For every strike he made, she answered with one of her own, until their movements blended into a rhythm that neither had planned but both trusted. The enemy pressed harder, their voices rising in frustration. A cannon blast struck near the human, throwing him against the rubble. He landed hard, rolling onto his side. Lyra's heart stopped. She sprinted forward, firing wildly, pulling him back with all the strength she had left. His blood streaked across her hands, warm and real, but his eyes opened again, stubborn as ever. "I'm fine," he muttered, even though he clearly wasn't. He pushed himself back up, refusing to stay down. Lyra stared at him, her chest tightening. She had been ready to die alone. She had accepted it. But now, watching him rise again and again, something inside her burned brighter. Her fear was still there, was drowned out by something stronger. Trust. She no longer fought only for herself. The enemy line hesitated. They had expected her to be weak, alone, broken. Instead, they faced two figures standing together in defiance. One alien soldier on the edge of collapse, and one human who refused to fall. Lyra raised her weapon again, her hands steady this time. The human met her eyes and gave a small nod. They didn't need words. Together, they stepped back into the storm, ready to fight until there was nothing left to give. The battlefield quieted for a short while, only the crackle of fires and the groans of the wounded filling the ruins. Lyra sat against a wall, her armor scorched and leaking sparks. The human crouched nearby, tearing strips of cloth from his torn shirt to bind the cut on his arm. His hands moved quickly, not with the skill of a medic, but with the confidence of someone who had done this many times before. She watched him in silence, trying to understand. Humans were not soldiers of this war. They weren't supposed to be here at all. Yet this one fought with the fury of someone who belonged to the battlefield. His strength wasn't from alien power or advanced weapons. It came from something else, something she couldn't name. Finally, her voice broke the silence. "Who are you?" He didn't look up. He tightened the knot on his arm, hissed through clenched teeth, then gave her a half smile. "Just someone who hates bullies." The answer made no sense to her. Hatred of bullies did not explain the scars on his body, the burns on his skin, or the way he moved through battle as if he had danced with death before. His eyes held shadows, memories of fights that went beyond anything she had known. "You're not a soldier," she said softly, half accusing, half curious. He shrugged, sliding the broken blade back into his grip. "Doesn't matter. I know how to fight." The simple words struck her harder than she expected. She thought of her squad, armed with the best weapons, trained for years, and still they had fallen. Yet this man, with nothing but scraps and willpower, had survived. It was impossible. She leaned her head back against the wall, her body aching. Questions burned in her chest. Why would a human step into an alien war? Why risk his life for someone not of his kind? But when she turned to ask again, she caught him staring into the firelit street with a look she recognized: loss. He had lost before, maybe too much. That pain was his answer. The enemy's shouts carried once more through the smoke, pulling her out of the moment. The human stood and offered her his hand. She hesitated only a second before gripping it, his rough strength pulling her back to her feet. For a strange heartbeat, the war around them felt distant. He didn't need to tell her who he truly was. She already understood enough. He was someone who refused to walk away, no matter the odds. Someone who carried the weight of battles he never wanted, but never avoided. And now, he was here with her. Lyra picked up her rifle, the core glowing faintly. The human lifted his battered weapon, shoulders squared. Together, they turned toward the smoke where the enemy gathered again. Neither spoke, but something unspoken bound them, an understanding that the fight was far from over. The rumble of enemy boots shook the ground as more soldiers poured into the ruined street. Their armor gleamed in the firelight, heavier than before, and their weapons hummed with deadly charge. Lyra's chest tightened. Her rifle was weak, its power cell nearly empty. The human beside her had only a dented blade and a stolen blaster that had long since clicked dry. By all logic, they had no chance. The enemy commander raised his arm, giving the order to fire. Lyra braced herself, but the human stepped forward first. He bent down, gripped a massive fallen blade from one of the enemy corpses, and lifted it with both hands. The weapon was built for alien soldiers twice his size. It should have been too heavy, impossible for him to wield. Yet he raised it, muscles straining, and held it steady. The sight stunned her as much as it stunned the enemy. For a heartbeat, their line faltered, confusion rippling through them. No human should be able to carry such weight. But this one did, his teeth clenched, his eyes blazing. Then he roared and charged. The enemy opened fire, but he darted through rubble, using speed and fury to close the gap. Plasma bolts scorched the ground around him, one grazing his side, but he didn't slow. His blade crashed down, sparks flying as he cut through the first soldier's weapon and sent the soldier sprawling. Lyra found her strength again. She raised her dying rifle and fired in bursts, covering his reckless advance. Every shot forced the enemy to split their focus, giving him room to strike. Together, their rhythm returned, his chaos breaking the enemy's order, her precision carving through the gaps he created. One soldier lunged at his back. Lyra shouted and blasted the attacker down. Another aimed a cannon toward her, but before it fired, the human swung his massive blade and shattered the cannon in half. Dust and fire rained across them, yet they stood, unyielding. The enemy formation broke. Fear spread in their eyes as the human fought with impossible strength, and the alien girl beside him refused to fall. They had expected to crush one exhausted soldier. Instead, they faced a pair bound by something stronger than armor or weapons, sheer will. Lyra felt her heart racing, not just from battle, but from something deeper. Each time the human should have fallen, he rose again. Each time she faltered, he stood closer, guarding her without hesitation. Step by step, they drove the enemy back until the street that had been their grave now became their ground. When the last soldier fled into the smoke, silence fell once more. The human leaned on the heavy blade, breathing hard, blood staining his side. Lyra lowered her weapon, her legs trembling. Her mind could not understand how they had survived. Yet as she looked at him, standing tall with fire still in his eyes, she knew this fight was far from finished. Something greater had just begun. The night deepened, and the ruins glowed with the faint light of burning wreckage. The smell of smoke and blood lingered in the air. Lyra sat against a cracked wall, her body shaking from exhaustion. She tried to steady her breathing, but every muscle ached. The human was beside her, tearing cloth from his clothes to press against his bleeding side. His face was pale, but his hands did not tremble. He looked at her wounds and frowned. Without asking, he pulled her arm toward him and began wrapping it. His touch was rough, untrained, yet strangely careful. She flinched at first, but did not pull away. No one in her squad had ever treated her wounds like this. For her people, weakness was a burden, and the weak were left behind. Yet here was this human, hurt worse than her, still thinking of her survival. "You need rest," he said quietly, tightening the bandage. "And you need more than rest," she replied, her voice weak but sharp. "You bleed more than I do," he smirked faintly. "Still standing, aren't I?" His stubbornness made her chest tighten. She wanted to tell him to stop, to sit down, to save his own strength, but the words died on her tongue. Instead, she found herself watching him closely, trying to understand why he kept fighting when everything was against them. In the quiet between battles, the firelight flickered across his face, showing every scar, every line carved by struggle. She realized then that his strength didn't come from weapons or training. It came from something harder, an unbroken spirit. He had chosen to fight when he could have walked away. Her heart stirred in a way she had never felt before. She was a soldier, trained to see allies as tools, partners as duty. But with him, it was different. Each time he rose to face the enemy, he gave her a reason to stand too. She wasn't fighting for her command anymore. She wasn't even fighting for her people. She was fighting because he was. The silence was broken by distant shouts. More enemies were searching the ruins. The human stood, gripping his battered weapon, ready once again. Lyra pushed herself up beside him, ignoring the fire in her legs. Their eyes met, and no words were needed. Something had formed between them in the chaos of war. Not command, not duty. Something stronger. It was trust. A bond forged not by blood, but by the choice to stand together when both should have fallen. And as the shadows of the enemy grew closer, Lyra knew that Bond would carry them through the next storm. Dawn crept slowly over the shattered city, its pale light breaking through the smoke. The battlefield was quiet now, broken only by the crackle of distant fires and the moans of the wounded. Lyra stood with her weapon hanging at her side, her armor blackened and scarred. Beside her, the human leaned on the massive blade, his body bloodied, his clothes torn, but his stance unbroken. The first reinforcements arrived, their armored vehicles rolling across the ruins. Soldiers poured out, their eyes widening at the sight before them. They had expected to find only death here. Instead, they found two figures standing side by side among piles of fallen enemies. Whispers spread quickly. "That's the girl who was left for dead." And with her, a human? Their voices carried awe and disbelief. The human ignored them, his gaze fixed on the horizon, as if still expecting another wave of attackers. Lyra felt her chest tighten, not from fear this time, but from something else. Pride. When an officer approached, demanding to know how they had survived, Lyra said nothing. She glanced at the human, and he gave only a faint shrug. He didn't claim victory, didn't boast. He looked as if the fight was simply what needed to be done. To him, saving her hadn't been glory, it had been a choice. That silence spoke louder than any answer. The story began spreading even before the battlefield was cleared. The tale of an exhausted alien soldier who should have fallen, and the human who appeared from nowhere to fight beside her. Lyra watched as the soldiers carried away the wounded, their eyes often returning to the human with quiet respect. She knew this moment was not just survival. It was the beginning of something larger, something that would echo far beyond this broken city. She turned to him, her voice low. "You changed everything." He met her gaze, weary but steady. "No, we did." In that instant, Lyra understood. She would never again think of herself as alone. The line that had broken in the night had been reforged, not by strength or technology, but by the will of one human who refused to leave her side. And that story, whispered through the ranks, would grow into legend. The day a human stood beside an alien and proved that even in the darkest hour, no one truly fights alone.